It's time for some nuts and bolts. So let's talk about structure, specifically the three-act structure. What is it? Where does it come from? And why is it important?
Three-act structure.
Backstory. Aristotle said all tragedy should have a beginning, middle, and end. In Aristotle's time, Greek tragedy actually came in 5 parts: prologue, parados, episode, stasimon, and exodus. Prologue and parados served as the setup and start of the story, the beginning. Episode and stasimon were about action and stasis, which was a stationary interlude with song. This would repeat as a cycle. Episode and stasimon, action, reaction, highs and lows, forming the main part of the story, the middle section. Exodus was the resolution, the end of the story. Like all academics that followed, Aristotle didn't invent this structure. He merely observed it and wrote it down. However, it was the Roman Horace who defined a strict 5-act structure for theatre in his text Ars Poetica, or The Art of Poetry. This unfortunately became the model for theatre for nearly 2,000 years. Among its strictures was that all drama should take place in one location and in a single day. Even Shakespeare followed these guidelines, writing plays with 5 acts, but he was not as heavily influenced, thankfully, by the other restrictions. It wasn't until the 19th century that writers like Goethe and Scribe started to buck this neoclassical form and define new approaches to telling stories. Around this time, the next most important guide for writers came out, Techniques of the Drama by Gustav Freytag. This was a more useful guide to dramatic structure, coming as it did from an actual writer of theatre, offering guidelines rather than rules. It's best illustrated with this, Freytag's pyramid. This doesn't so much define acts as it does the dynamics of action in a story. It does still hold to a kind of 5-act form, but can also be readily adapted to suit a 3-act story structure, with 3 major turning points here defined. Playwrights like Ibsen and Shaw built on this, and then when film came along, it was refined further, based largely on what audiences responded to, and not what some ancient Roman academic said were the rules.
What is an act?
Now, before we go on, let's be clear what we mean when we say an act. There are 2 definitions, both current and useful, but different. The first is simply a unit of dramatic action consisting of several scenes. This is more a practical definition, usually defined by the rise and fall of a curtain or by a blackout in the theatre. Plays began being written with 3 clear acts in the 1800s, which fits neatly with our Aristotelian definition. However, most modern theatre now has just 2 acts, with an intermission in the middle, where people can go to the bathroom, get a drink, and buy some merch. So even though this demands a good cliffhanger at the end of Act 1, which is the midpoint of the story, this is a more pragmatic interruption, rather than a dramatic turning point. The other way to define an act is strictly in terms of story, and how it is structured dramatically. This is what Freytag, and later observers like William Archer, in playmaking, and then John Howard Lawson, in theory and technique of playwriting, were getting at. Even though it wasn't being called 3-act structure quite yet. It was in Kenneth Rowe's Write That Play from 1939 that the 3-act structure is clearly defined as the way modern drama was being written. Rowe writes, "In recent years, by no rule, but in general practice, 3 acts has come more and more to be the standard. 3 movements are clearly more basic to the fundamental structure of a dramatic action than Horace's 5. There is an attack, a crisis, and a resolution. There is a natural symmetry and balance with adequate flexibility inherent in the 3-act form, with the first act introductory and springing the attack, the second act developing the action to the crisis, and the third act for the resolution." While all these observers are primarily talking about theatre, these days 3-act structure is found most crucially in films, though it can also apply just as well to TV and even novels. They all have beginning, middle, and end. Aristotle was right after all.
Three-act structure in the movies.
Screenwriting structure as we know it today started with Sid Field in 1979 with his book, Screenplay, The Foundations of Screenwriting. Like others before him, he was simply setting out what he observed in the stories that were being made, in his case, movies. And this is the basic structure he defined. Later writers have refined this, sometimes using different terms for the same thing. For example, the first major event that gets your story started is called the inciting incident, or catalyst. Some observers call the turning point at the end of Act 1 the inciting incident, while others call it turning point 1 or plot point 1. This is just semantics. The structure still holds true whatever you call the pieces. I'll talk more in later videos about some of these refinements and alternatives. But just know, when anyone talks about the three-act structure, this is it. And while it seems kind of rigid, presented here as a diagram, it's important to understand these are not rules, but guidelines. It's not a formula, but a paradigm. A form that has been used deliberately or instinctively by writers for hundreds, indeed thousands of years. We don't write this way because some book tells us to. We write this way because it works. There are other structures that can also work. This three-act structure is just the most common, especially in films. Also note that while this structure splits your story roughly into 4 equal parts, Act 1, Act 2 Part 1 and Part 2, and Act 3, these parts do not have to be equal in length or screen time. In fact, the final part, which is Act 3, is often shorter than the others. Now, that said, each section is usually around the same length, and this is proportional to your total runtime, meaning it doesn't matter how long or short your story is, this overall structure still applies. It also doesn't matter what genre or medium you're writing for, this paradigm still works. So, you'd be well advised to build your stories with this structure in mind. Now, that said, don't force your story to suit some format you think it needs to follow. This is, after all, just a guide.
The code is more what you call guidelines than actual rules.
And while there's a reason this structure has become the standard, there are many good films that do not strictly conform to this three-act structure. More on those later. There are also many good films that seem to not follow this form, and yet on closer examination they most definitely do. They're just very good at hiding it.
Writing a script in 3 acts.
When starting a new script, plan your story with the three-act structure in mind. Every writer is different though. Some like to map out everything beforehand, all the major turning points and lots of detail in between. They plot it out thoroughly before writing a single word of actual script. Some writers prefer to start knowing very little about where the story will go, and they work it out on the page. Though it's a good idea to at least know what your ending will be, so you have a goal to write towards. With that done, forget about structure and just write. Then, once you've completed your first draft, you can go back and see how closely your script conforms to the paradigm. Did your turning points land where you expected? Are the 4 sections roughly equal in length? Things will be different from your original plan, that's normal. Your script may end up a lot longer than you anticipated, in particular your first act. That's also quite common. This is what first drafts are for. Now that you have something to work off, you can diagnose how well it's working and how to restructure things to better fit the paradigm. To shorten Act 1, flesh out Act 2 with more conflict, or maybe add a new twist to Act 3 before the final resolution. Keeping in mind this is just a guide,
Guidelines.
and it is flexible. If the story is working despite not following the structure, then don't worry about it. Perhaps your story is best served by a different structure. Or perhaps you've hit upon something that actually is within the structure, just not the way you thought.
Small steps.
The three-act structure is the most reliable way to tell a story. It's been developed and tested over thousands of years. If you follow it, it does a lot of the hard work for you in building a cohesive story that will engage with an audience, while still giving you the freedom and the responsibility to come up with something original and new. If you're a new writer, start with this. Then, once you learn the rules, the
Guidelines.
feel free to bend and break them as much as you like. In future videos, I'll go into more depth on the specific turning points and other story structures one can use. But for now, I'm Phil Moore. Chookers.